welcome today, everybody, to our webinar. It's the final in our series about Copilot readiness. And now today we're going to be focusing on access. We're going to be looking at hubs, site and navigation, and we're going to be looking at the site lifecycle. These are all important because it's all about Microsoft's message of saying, give people just enough access to the information that they need. And that's because Copilot will look at the information that you've been granted access to, form its responses. And so really, we need to dive a little bit deeper in this session than we have in the other ones and really look at the architecture and the governance of SharePoint. So it's a bit more technical, a bit deeper, but hopefully you'll get an appreciation of some of the things which need to happen. Now, Ben, that's my intro. Why don't you take us through who this is for and what they're going to get from what you're going to share with us today?
Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Rupert. So yes, this is for anyone who is planning your information architecture, getting ready for Microsoft Copilot, so your set up sites, your structures, etc. Or you may already be frustrated with things like sprawl of SharePoint sites and Microsoft Teams, and maybe duplications of sites for the same purpose, which is sort of leading to inconsistent results or duplication. So looking at some takeaways from this then, so we'll look through three key areas. So the first is around understanding sites themselves. So what are the different templates? What are hubs? How can we use navigation to make things clear? We'll then look through some approaches to access. So how do we manage permissions or site permissions within SharePoint and making sure that people have got access to what they need and nothing else? And then finally, we're going to look at the site lifecycle from the creation of a site all the way through its usage to the point when it becomes end of life and it can be archived.
I think archive's taken a additional meaning now that Microsoft Archive has just been launched. So that's going to be an interesting one to explore. Now, Ben, this is part of a series of webinars we have. You will find the other two on YouTube, where we talk about initially about managing data and particularly redundant, obsolete and trivial data, what that means and what to do with it. Then we're looking at managing documents, things like naming, manage metadata, version control. And then we have today's session on governance. Now, all of this has been driven on the Microsoft Best Practice Readiness Guide for Copilot. We tell you a lot about what you need to do. What we're trying to do is take you to how you could actually do it. So adding that additional bit of value from, look, here's a high level to let's get boots on the ground. So then, without further ado, I think it's worth starting about understanding SharePoint sites for different types of sites and when you might use those type of sites.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've summarized this on this deck here, and then I'm going to go in and sort of show what some of this means in practice. So really, when we're thinking about the different types of SharePoint sites available to us nowadays, there's three that we're interested in. Now, I'm actually going to start from the right-hand side first, which is the communication site. So this is a site that you typically use in an intranet scenario. If you're looking to promote something or share news through internal comms, perhaps you're publishing policies and templates for people to access. So it's much more of a sort of broadcast of how you use those sites. And what that means in terms of Copilot is thinking about that will typically have a small group of users that manage that site, but then a large group of users that will have read access. And this would be a definitive place that you'd want Copilot to be bringing its answers from. So the other two types of sites are both called a team site, but the key difference is that one of them has a Microsoft 365 group attached to it. So that is effectively the building block of something that is used within Microsoft Teams, and then the other one doesn't. So the scenario for a team site that does have a Microsoft 365 group is very much for that collaboration concept. It could be internal department areas, it could be cross-functional teams, for instance. Whereas a team site without a Microsoft 365 group is better suited to something that's much more of a document management scenario. Perhaps it's a shared filing area for your client records or your contracts or something along those lines. You don't really want to be applying a team or a Microsoft 365 group to that because it creates more noise than is actually needed. So we're going to have a quick look at that in our demo environment in a minute. So if we just jump into our SharePoint sites, the first thing is that communication site. So we're looking at a SharePoint intranet homepage. And you can see from this, it's got news content, links to useful tools, and things that can tell the difference between that and a team site. There's no navigation down the left-hand side. Any navigation would appear at the top. That's not specifically, accurate anymore, but we don't need to worry about that too much. The next type of site that we talked about was a team site with a group. So if I go into my HR area here, we have modified slightly the default template layout here. The key thing that we can highlight around this is how users have got access. So we can see that this has got multiple members added via a group, and we can see who the owners and members are here. And we can also see we've got this Teams icon, which is highlighting that this thing has actually been connected to a Microsoft Team to provide that conversational chat element to it. But then the third type is the team site with no group, and we're using that for our sort of client document management scenario. So again, it's not that obvious the difference between a team site with a group or without a group visually. But one of the things that you can see within this is if I click on the admin settings here, it's giving me an option to connect it to a new Microsoft 365 if I want to, which is highlighting it's not already there. And again, in terms of permission management, that looks subtly different. We're looking at site access instead of group membership. So that's just a quick overview of the three different site types. Now, the thing that you may have noticed is that we have this navigation that is tying everything together. So this navigation has been brought through as part of the SharePoint hub that we have applied that connects all of these sites together. So effectively, a hub is a group of sites that all form perhaps part of a common purpose or a division. And the key thing that they give you is that context so that as you move across the different sites in the hub, that navigation is still there and consistent. So if we jump back to the deck and we kind of have a quick summary around those hub sites. So just taking a look at this, we looked at this scenario of different hubs, and there's often a question of how many hubs should you have? And I would say it depends what type of organization you are. So if you're a large organization, sort of plus 1,000 users, you will tend to have multiple hubs, and they would typically be aligned around perhaps your business divisions. Maybe it's your geographical regions. You might have a North America hub and a Europe hub, for instance, or maybe you've got sort of cross-regional business functions that would be connected together. If you're in a smaller organization, then our recommendation typically is to organize those hubs either into a single hub, as we saw in our demo just then, or organize them more around the use case. So you might want an intranet hub that is focused purely on content that's served up by an intranet. You might want a collaboration or a projects hub, for instance. But as I say, that's much more aligned by use case as opposed to organizational boundaries. So let's move on to the next point.
One thing I just want to touch on there, Ben, is that point in the bottom right-hand corner is those of you who've come from on-premise environments or have used classic SharePoint, subsites are no longer a good thing to have in your SharePoint setup. I think that's what I understand, Ben. I think, and although this is very high level, we need to start at a high level so we can get down to the low level, which is just enough access.
So yeah, that leads us on to the next topic.
So look, access management seems to be increasingly complicated. Not only have Microsoft just renamed AD to Entra, but there's this idea of how do I manage access to SharePoint, to Teams, to the information which underlies that. I know that when people create teams or create sites, they're always thinking, well, now I've created this, who has access to it? Is it me? Is it my team? Is it my organization? Now, I know earlier, Ben, prior to this webinar, you were talking to me about dynamic group membership being the way forward of how we can get the balance of quick response time to somebody needing access based on their change in their role, balance with putting governance in place. So I'd be really interested to hear everything you've got to talk about, but particularly that one there.
So I think this is a common challenge because ultimately how you give access to your SharePoint sites is going to have a big impact in terms of what content is being served up by Copilot. So we talked about this just enough access. It really does come into play here. So looking at the IT managed permissions, we think this works well across in department scenarios and processes where that structure of the sites has already been set up and it can be more centrally managed. It means that things are going to be more consistent in terms of who's got access to what, which also leads then to lower risk of people having too much access. If you can tie this into a joiners, movers, leavers process, then you can manage that moving users around into the right groups, and certainly with people being onboarded, making sure they've got access to the groups that they need. And what we're going to demonstrate in a minute is that actually how you can make that even more seamless using dynamic group membership, that it ties into users' attributes as opposed to having to physically assign users to groups. On the other side of things, though, is user managed permissions. So again, this works better for projects or working groups where they're effectively cross-functional, cross-departmental, and it's not always clear how they tie into a dedicated organizational structure. Again, this is more relevant for self-service scenarios, or perhaps if you've got limited IT resource to manage those things. And again, the advantage is that they can be quite quick to action. So if someone's spun up a site through a self-service process and they can just go and add in the users that they need. The downside is it can lead to inconsistent approaches in terms of who's got access to what. Maybe people have got too much access or people haven't got access to what they need. And particularly relevant when people move across the organization. I think in reality, you need to consider a hybrid approach. So a combination of both of those approaches and making sure you're using what's relevant at the time. So what we're going to do is have a quick look at how that comes into play in SharePoint. So if I just jump back to my SharePoint site here, I'm going to come to this client site. And we're going to have a look at the permissions for this site here. And just at a very high level, if you're not already familiar, in SharePoint, we're thinking about 3 levels of access. So that is the owners who will have full control. This often might be an IT administrator role. The users that will have edit rights, the ability to edit documents, and then visitors who have read access to that site. So we can see in this case that the site owner is a single person. Ideally, that should be more than one, and typically that might be an admin, as I said. But within our site members here, we've got these security groups. So we've said that the operations security group and the sales and marketing group have got edit access. And we can just simply map those groups from Entra into SharePoint, and they'll be able to have the access that they need. We also have this all staff group here. So one of the considerations we need to have is that your Entra, your Active Directory, is going to be made up of employees, but it's also going to have accounts, conference rooms. It's going to have maybe some external contractors that have been given a license for certain reasons. Maybe it's subcontractors that you work with. So it's not always good enough to just simply use the everyone except external access group, which you might use typically. You may want to actually narrow that down to make sure that it is literally just your employees. And the best way, and I think simplest way of doing that, is to use dynamic group membership. So I've come to this all staff group here. I can see that group membership has been set as dynamic user.
Ben, and then I can ask a question. I know you're in Azure here. Do I have access to this if I've just got a Microsoft 365 license, or do I need some Azure stuff as well?
No, this is all part of Microsoft 365. So, even if you're not using Azure for things like infrastructure and virtual machines, you will have access to this as long as you're an administrator within your Microsoft 365 tenant. Yeah, okay. Absolutely. So I'm going to come into dynamic membership rules here. And I can go and add some rules because I've put quite a few in. It's not let me do it through the UI here. But what I can see, if I click on this edit button, I've effectively built a query that says how I'm going to filter out who's got access. The first thing is I want their accounts to be enabled. I don't want any accounts that have blank email addresses because it's more likely that they're a real person. And then we've got some custom phrases. If you've used things like conference room, we can remove that based on the display name. And then we've got another scenario here where we perhaps, if we bring in a contractor, we put the name of their company in brackets. So I've filtered out anything that contains the bracket characters. So we can then test that. So if I go into validate rules, I'm aware of this external contractor as part of Tailspin Toys. And we can see there's this person, Brian Johnson, Tailspin. So I can test whether or not they're going to have access to this group. So if I just select them, and we should be able to see, yeah, they've been blocked from having access to this group, and we can see why. So yeah, they were enabled. They did have an email address, but their display name contains those brackets characters, which is why they've been filtered out. So then if I look at my members, I can see here's all the users, all of the test accounts and the conference room accounts and those external contractors. So anyone that's in this group is going to then have read access to the files within this SharePoint site here.
And so if I just got my department set up correctly in my profile when as part of my intro account, it's going to take that information. So if it says HR, it's going to use that to drive what potential groups I can be a member of.
Sorry, that's a really good point. Yeah, absolutely. So as long as that information has been populated in your Azure Active Directory profile, and again, that's something that can be managed as part of a joiners, movers, leavers process. Let's say their department changes, you change their department, and then it will automatically route them from one group to another, for instance.
And that's the big issue, isn't it? Because often with leavers, it's easy. We just turn off and they've lost their license, they've lost access. But when you move from one department to another, often you get added in new permissions, but your old permissions don't get removed. And suddenly you've got access to everything as you move around the organization. So it really helps on governance. It's a really interesting one.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So the next point then we want to have a look at is how this actually comes into play with Microsoft Teams. So we've got three concepts of teams that we need to be thinking about here. So there are three types of teams that you can create at a high level. So we have organization-wide teams, which are all company forums, all company broadcast areas. And basically what happens here is that anyone who's got a license in your organization will be automatically added to that team, whether you want them to or not. Any information, any files that have been added into that team are all going to be in scope for Copilot automatically. Public teams are teams that users can see and choose to join. They appear in the team's directory, but the other consideration is that, again, regardless of if they join that team or not, any files in that team will also be visible to Copilot, and we'll see why in a minute. And then the final point is private teams. So these are typically aligned to things like projects, departments, working groups. Users have to be invited or managed. Users can request to join, but provided that they have a direct link to that team. They can't browse to see that that team is there. So if you had a sensitive redundancy project, for instance, people wouldn't be able to see it unless they were specifically invited to that team.
And
so we're going to have
go on. Just on the data and scope, you talk about public teams. Even though I haven't joined that team, that data is going to be A, granted to me, and B, therefore, is granted to Copilot. So if I write a query and it finds some information in, let's say, Cycling Club, which I'm not a member of, it's going to make that as part of my response.
Yeah, absolutely. To be clear, it's any files in that team as opposed to the conversations. Okay. But yeah, any files within that team.
The underlying SharePoint data, which sits behind that team. Okay.
That's right. That's exactly it. So I think we're going to take a quick look at that now, actually. So if I just jump into Microsoft Teams here, so I can see that I've got this public team that I've spun up earlier. So, but what I'm going to do is have a look at the permissions behind the scenes of this. So first of all, if I look at the team itself and I look at the membership of this team, at the moment, there's only one person in that team. So users will be able to see it and they'll be able to join it if they want to. But at the moment, there aren't any members because they haven't chosen to join yet. However, if I look at the Files tab, and then I want to go and have a look at what that looks like inside SharePoint. If you're not familiar, the Files tab within Teams is connected to a SharePoint site that is spun up at the same time. So I'm going to have a look at the SharePoint site for this team, and I'm just going to go to the site permissions area here, and we're going to look at those three groups we talked about before. So within the owners, basically anyone that was made an owner of the team is going to be an owner of the site. If I just have a look at the visitors, no one's got read access to this site. So you'd think, okay, well, maybe that's great. The problem is here. So any members of the team have got edit access over that site, but also every other person who has a license in your organization has also got edit access to that site, regardless of if they're a member of that team or not. Okay, so that's my concern. The thing I don't particularly like about public teams is, people may think that, okay, well, I haven't joined it, but that information is going to be searchable. And when it comes to Copilot is going to be looking at all of that data and surfacing it back, whether or not you realize you're a member of that team or not. So I think the main takeaway from us on this particular point is that as much as possible, we recommend our clients to use private teams and then use dynamic group membership so you have much more control who's got access.
Now, Ben, moving on from that, let's talk about some of the controls we can put around teams to help manage security of those teams.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the final point here is the concept of a sensitivity label to apply it to our team and then control all of these different things in one go. So effectively, we're classifying a team or a SharePoint site as saying this is a highly confidential team, and therefore it's much more restricted than, say, a public team or an internal only team, if that makes sense. So yeah, the things that we can do, we can manage whether or not it's public or private. We can control whether or not users can access externally, and that's both being guests of the team for conversations and also whether or not they can access the files within those teams via SharePoint. And then the final thing that we can do is choose to restrict what types of devices. So do those devices need to be company-owned laptop? Would people with a bring your own device be able to access that data? So again, that can be managed in that way. So I'm just going to demonstrate this very quickly. If I just jump into my teams again, I'm going to go and create a new team here. And I can see I'm being prompted to choose the sensitivity for this team. So we have created our own set of sensitivity labels. So have a look at that in a second. So we've defined an all staff label, confidential label, and restricted label. And we've put some descriptions in it that will help the users to determine which they should use and when. So let's say I've got this confidential scenario. It's telling me that the team is going to be private, requiring users to add them. External sharing is supported because you may need to collaborate with a third party. And although it's not coming through in the description there, we're allowing external access, but not via the team's desktop and only via the web, and they won't be able to download data. So if I go and set that to confidential, I can see that the other two types have been disabled. I can then choose to create a private team and do what I need to do. So I'm not going to go all the way through that. But what I am going to do is just show you where these labels have been set up so that you've got some visibility in how to manage them yourself. So if I go and have a look at my labels, I've gone inside Microsoft Purview and I'm looking at information protection. I can see that I've created this heading for site governance, and these are applied to sites as opposed to being applied to documents. If I go in and edit the confidential label, fingers crossed it won't take too long to load. Sometimes it takes a few seconds.
Now, Ben, this is nothing that we've built. This is all part of Microsoft 365 that's built into the package. I'm guessing E3 license, is that right?
Yeah, so this is Microsoft 365 E3 or Microsoft 365 Business Premium will support this functionality. Yep.
Okay.
So I'm going to go through, look at my settings. It's relevant for sites and not items. I'm not interested in that because, again, that's more for documents. And here I can see where I'm controlling the privacy and the external access levels. So on the teams and groups side of things, I'm being forced to create private teams only. And I am actually, in this case, allowing external access because there still is scenarios where confidential data may need to be shared with a designated third party. So I am allowing external access in that case. On the SharePoint side, i.e. files, the documents in the files tab, again, we are allowing external access, but we've disabled anyone links. That means that people will need to sign in order to validate their identity to be able to access that data. And in addition, we've said that users can access that SharePoint site, but if they're not coming from a company managed laptop, then they're only going to be able to access via the web, and they're not going to be able to download any files. Again, we've got that option if we want to take it a step further and block their access completely. That's just a quick overview of how we can use sensitivity labels to control all of those things in one go. So let's just sort of go back to the summary slide there before we move on to the last section.
Yeah, so Ben, very interesting because a lot of people are like, either lock down the whole environment or it's a free-for-all. And actually, there's a middle ground here saying, well, let's apply the right level of sensitivity, the right kind of content. And definitely can see the benefit of that. And obviously, guest users is a hot topic with many organizations that we speak to. Device access, another interesting point there, the fact that we can say, well, look, we don't trust your device, so it's web only. And I think that's an interesting one too. Good stuff. Okay, conscious of time, let's move on to the final part, which is around the site lifecycle.
So when we're thinking of the site lifecycle, really what we're really considering here is the way in which sites are created, and then obviously they'll go through and be used, but then also how do we shut them down where they're no longer relevant? If we are allowing people to create sites, we need to make sure that they're being created in a managed way. And then we don't want to have sites lying around that aren't adding any value, because again, all of this is going to cause issues with Copilot in terms of the relevance of the information. Now, the final point that we're going to demonstrate is how you can tie that together in a slightly more custom process where you can apply your own business rules using the Power Platform. So on the creation side, I think one of the key considerations here is, again, are you going to allow self-service, or does that creation need to be managed via IT? Quite often we will see and we'll recommend that you disable your end users from being able to create Microsoft Teams, because that can lead to sprawl. Instead, we'd recommend that you put a slightly more customized process in the way, or manage that process through requests. And then finally, using out of the box functionality, we can apply some naming policies to at least have a sort of level of standardization on how these teams get named. On the archive side, you have a manual archiving capability in Teams. If you want to apply that to SharePoint, then realistically, you're going to have to use some PowerShell to do it. We're going to take a quick look at group expiration policies and what they mean, and then finally, Microsoft 365 Archive. And then we'll go through our custom process and how you can tie all of that together. So just very quickly looking at the creation, I'm not going to go through all of these points, but it's worth having a look at the group naming policies a second. So if I just come into here and go to our Azure portal. So I can see within my group settings, I've got this naming policy. I can do things like, I might just zoom in quickly. I can do things like set a list of custom blocked words if you want to reserve words, for instance. Now, if we have a look at the policy itself, I can basically choose to add a prefix or a suffix. So let's say, for instance, I wanted to suffix the country and the department on my group name. Then the first thing I'd do is just put a little hyphen in there. And then I'm going to add in an attribute. And I can see I've got a fairly limited set of options here. I'm going to add in the country or region, add another hyphen, and then add in another attribute, which is the department. And you can see that it's showing me how that's going to appear when I create that group name. I would generally recommend using suffixes rather than prefixes, because when we're looking at that within Microsoft Teams, if you put lots of prefixes in, users aren't actually going to be able to see what that team is. So we put a fairly short prefix in, but actually you're better off putting things at the end of the team name instead of the beginning. So that's group creation. And again, you can restrict who can have access to create groups. That's a set of PowerShell I'm not going to go into. Moving over to the other side of things, though, it's worth having a look at archive. So within Teams, I can archive teams directly. I can't do it from here, but if I go in and click on the Manage Teams option, I can come through, find that team, Hydro Solar, and choose to archive it. It's prompted me, do I want to make the SharePoint site read-only? So I'm going to go and tick that and push the archive button.
And if you don't tick that box, Ben, what happens? Is it current access, or does it remove all access?
Is current access. So if you don't make it read-only, the SharePoint site underneath will just stay accessible in the same way.
So however you archive it using that approach, end users and hence Copilot will still have access to that data.
Yeah, absolutely. So they're still going to have access to the data. There's no permissions that have been removed. It's just stopped it from appearing in my list of teams, and it's stopped it from being editable. So previously that might be good enough, but in a Copilot scenario, that data is still there and people can still access it, and it's going to be driving results. Now, at the other extreme end of the scale, we could take the expiration policy approach that is available within Azure. Now, what this does is say, okay, basically after 180 days, for example, whoever is registered as an owner of the site is going to have to confirm that it's still used. And if they don't, then it's going to get deleted. So that probably takes it a bit too far, and users can get very nervous when they think that their data is going to be automatically deleted after a period of time. And so it kind of defeats the purpose a little bit. So as I say, I find this as the sort of hammer to crack a nut scenario, realistically, which is a little bit too powerful, if you will. Now, of course, we also have Microsoft 365 Archive. So I'm going to come into my SharePoint Admin Center here, and I can see I've got this SharePoint site that I'm going to go and archive. This archive option is now available. And what this is going to do is deactivate the site, remove all access from it, and importantly, reduce the impact of that data on your storage allocation. So really, to be honest, moving forward, this is the approach that you want to be looking at in terms of archiving your site. So using Microsoft Archive, because it's going to be useful for Copilot because you won't see the data anymore, and it's going to be useful for your site admins because it's not going to be clogging up data in your allocation. Now, the final point is how can you tie that together into a slightly more bespoke process? So I'm just going to summarize this quite quickly. So this is something that we've done for a customer quite recently, which is where we've implemented a bespoke request mechanism using the Power Platform. So users can come here or admins can come here and request a site. You can align it to a business function, for instance. You can choose from a predefined set of templates that are slightly more relevant and customized to use cases. We can pick information such as what business function is going to be relevant to it, and that can then tie into default metadata similar to what we showed you in our previous webinar. Workspace for the management of contracts for our professional services team. So I'm going to go through and create that. Again, I can put in, I can align it to a given hub and have it automatically join a hub. So I call this contract management, and we'll see as I click through, it's giving me some visibility of that URL that's going to be used. So again, it will go and double check if there's a site already there. And then we can start adding in some of our custom business process relevance. So in the case of our customer, they have this concept of a data owner who's the person who would be responsible for any data that goes in that site. So I'm going to go and add in Megan. And then I've got a few more options. I can assign things like a retention label. I can control the external access. And then I'm just going to confirm that and push submit. So what we've done with this is then tie it into an approval process. So I'm not going to wait for that approval to come through, but what we'll see is if I look through into my list of approvals within Microsoft Teams, I can see that approval has come through. So someone who may be an IT admin or perhaps devolve based on different departments can say, okay, this person's requested this site. You could capture information like what is the purpose of it, et cetera, and then choose to actually approve that request.
And you can still tie your sensitivity labels with that, can you, in that process?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So if I just go back to the site governance area, again, I'm not going to wait for this to spin up because this is firing something in Azure to provision the site for you, but it'll go and spin up the site, and then you have your register here with the created date, the additional sort of more business information, and you can tie it into things like expiration, etc. And then finally, when you're done, you can tie this into a process to archive the site, which will tap into the things that we've talked about earlier. So it's worth just, again, I think, summarizing those points and just jumping back to the deck.
Yes, that was an interesting one, Ben, particularly towards the end where, yes, if you're, I guess it's medium-sized business, you can do all these things manually and start plugging those together. When you get to size of scale or enterprise, you need more of a process-driven approach to site creation, but also balancing the security required. Again, going back to that principle of just enough access. I think we'll just jump onto the takeaway slide so we can bring this to a close. So at the top, we talked about understanding sites, and really it's the right kind of site for the right use case. Think about the life cycle. How long does that site need to last for? And then the hubs provide the context of where that site sits in your organization. And we talked about larger organizations maybe having multiple hubs. If you're a small to mid-sized organization, you might just have a single hub, because we are thinking about complexity and support here. But ultimately driving that user-friendly navigation. And one of the tips that I share with people is, look, that navigation doesn't need to point to the top of every site. It might point to pages within that site to get people to the information that they need to do their job. Then we talked about access and the various approaches. And I think it's two key takeaways. One is, let's avoid the use of those public teams, because it's going to give access to everybody for all that information, whether that's your intention or not. And start considering using dynamic groups to manage access, so you don't have to think about every time someone joins or moves, what do I need to add them to, because you've got that set up. And then the final piece there, we talked about site sprawl. Number of times we've gone to see clients and they've got hundreds of sites and nobody knows what's needed and what's not, because that governance isn't in play. Actually, no one's even aware that we could even take a site to end of life, so it just sits there. So That's real consideration. And yes, there are reports you can do to have a start looking at last activity and sites which might drive that archive process. So I hope you found this useful. Yeah, it was a bit more underneath the hood, shall we say, than the other two that we've done in this series. But really, I think it's important because you need to understand governance. And once this is in place, and it is some heavy lifting to start with, then the rest of the process runs a lot more smoothly. But anyway, thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed the series. If you missed the first two, you can go and find them on YouTube. If you'd like help or want to dive into any of these points further, do book a meeting or have a chat with us. There's a book a meeting link on our website, and that will drop something directly into my calendar, and we can explore further. But otherwise, thank you.